of the city's forgotten, secluded corners, there stood an antique shop that kept watch over dusty display windows and forgotten stories. It had no name. Its sign was peeling away. Only a dim light barely illuminated the chaos inside. I stepped in there that Saturday morning entirely by chance. Perhaps I was looking for an escape from the sterile monotony of modern life, from that meaningless sense of emptiness that surrounded me. Or perhaps something was drawing me inside. The moment I stepped through the door, the smell of mold, naphthalene, and dried wood filled my throat along with the chime of a bell ring, far more than the air that entered my lungs. It felt as if I had stepped into a place where time had stopped. Trinkets piled haphazardly on the shelves, rusty keys, faded photographs, leather-bound books whose pages had clearly not been read in years. Each object seemed wrapped in its own silence. There was no one inside, only a faint clicking sound coming from a corner, like the heavy ticking of an old clock. I moved through the narrow corridors, between mountains of objects. The creaking sound of the wooden floor beneath my feet echoed eerily in the shop's suffocating silence. And then I saw it in the darkest, most secluded corner of the shop. A mirror covered in dust and cobwebs. It seemed to glow as if it had its own light. Its frame was silver-colored, but darkened, oxidized, and blotched, with greenish stains from time's merciless touch. The motifs carved into it were so fine and complex that my eyes grew tired just looking at them. They looked like intertwined snakes, the roots of a tree stretching into eternity, or human figures locked together. I stepped closer. When my fingertips touched the cold, rusted frame, I jerked my hand back as if I had been shocked. A strange energy radiated from it. The glass was so dirty that I could barely make out my reflection. But what I could see was more than just a faint image of myself. Deep in my eyes, a shadow that was not my own appeared for a brief moment and vanished. Was it an optical illusion caused by exhaustion, or a trick of the mirror's grimy surface? I didn't dwell on it then. I only thought that this mirror was not ordinary. Just then, an old man appeared from the back of the shop. The brown, worn velvet jacket he wore looked like an extension of his skin. His face was filled with deep lines, and his eyes carried what seemed like the wisdom of centuries yet. At the same time, an indescribable weariness. In his hands was an old cloth he used for dusting, his fingers trembling. "Do you like it, son?" he said, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. He stepped closer, fixing his gaze on the mirror. The expression on his face changed in Celia, mix of respect, fear, and sorrow. "It's rare." "Betty, rare, what's so special about it?" I asked, unable to hide the curiosity in my voice. The old man extended his finger towards the mirror's silver frame, but pulled it back before daring to touch it. "Special. It doesn't just hold your reflection, it holds time. Sometimes the past, sometimes the future, but most of the time, it just holds you. It draws you in." He turned his eyes to me. There was a strange warning glint in them. "Be careful. Not every mirror is just a surface. Some are thresholds." What he said sounded absurd, just one of those legends an old man makes up to sell the oldest piece in his shop. And yet, for some reason, I felt an urge inside me. I had to buy this mirror. I didn't know why. Perhaps it was that strange energy. Perhaps the old man's trembling hands. Or perhaps I simply wanted to bring a new story into my empty home. "How much is it?" I asked, my throat tightening. "Special price for you," he said with a peculiar smile. "That mirror decides its own price. But you've already paid it." The smile slowly faded from his face, and that sorrowful look returned to his eyes. "Just take good care of it. It may not take good care of you." Despite all that strange talk, I bought the mirror. Even as I loaded it into the back of my van, it felt as though it had a weight of its own. Normally, it would have been easy to carry, but it seemed to be drawing something out of me, pulling me towards it like a magnet. On the way home, I occasionally felt as if the mirror was looking at me through the rearview mirror. Was it my own reflection or something else inside it? I couldn't be sure because the sunlight kept hitting the glass and flaring. There was a strange tightness in my chest. I didn't know it then, but I had brought home not just an object from that antique shop. I had brought a doorway that would turn the rest of my life into a nightmare. I hung the mirror on the empty wall in the living room, directly opposite the door, so I could always see it as I moved around the house. When I mounted it, it didn't look like a painting hanging from a nail. It was as if it had found its place, as if it belonged there. The room seemed to take a deep breath and fall into a heavy silence. The seedy noise, car horns from outside, distant children's laughter, all vanished with the presence of that mirror. It was as though the frame acted as a sound barrier. That first night, I got up to get a glass of water from the kitchen. The dim glow of the night lamp lit the corridor. I filled my glass with cold water from the fridge. As I lifted it to my lips, I was passing in front of the mirror in the living room. At that exact moment, an alarm bell rang in the back of my brain. I stopped. My breath caught. When I stopped, my reflection took a second to stop. 1 second. Something we perceive in microseconds. But in that moment, it was as if time itself had faltered. While I stood rigid, the silhouette in the mirror, in that brief interval, was looking at me from behind. My eyes widened in terror. I quickly turned to face the mirror. My reflection was right there, staring back at me in the same shock, but the look in its eyes wasn't pure surprise like mine. It was more like the unease in the eyes of someone caught committing a crime, or a predator stealthily approaching its prey. I set the glass down on the counter. My hand was shaking, my heart was pounding, my temples throbbing. Fatigas. Fatiga, or maybe the old man's words were stuck in my mind. I tried to convince myself. Logic was my greatest refuge at that moment. The next morning, as I got ready for work after showering, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth. I fixed my eyes on my reflection. It mimicked my movements, as usual. But then a brief flicker, like a dropped frame in a short video, its motion stuttered. While I was still brushing, it froze for a second, and in that instant, it tilted its head slightly to the left, as if looking at something behind me. What could have been behind me? A blank wall. I turned around quickly. There was nothing but the smooth white surface of the wall. With trembling hands, I set down my toothbrush. When I turned back to the mirror, that caught expression was on my reflection's face again, but this time there was a faint curl at the corner of its lips, a smirk, as if it were enjoying my shock. I rushed to get ready for work. When I stepped out of the house, the city noise filled my ears again. It felt as though the moment I left, that sound barrier had lifted. But even that noise brought me no comfort. One thought kept circling in my mind. The silence in the house, was it normal? That evening, when I returned from work, a strange smell hit my nose the moment I opened the door. A damp, old mold smell mixed with something slightly sweet, yet nauseating, as if the walls of the house were rotting from the inside. When I entered the living room and sat down on the sofa, I saw my reflection in the television's dark. Switched off screen, I froze. While I was sitting comfortably on the sofa, my reflection's hands were not resting on its knees. They were around its own neck. Its fingers looked as though they were squeezing its throat. Its face was deathly pale. I quickly brought my hands to my neck. My skin was warm, my pulse beating. But my reflection's hands were grayish, its nails long, its skin dried like a mummy's. Its eyes were closed. It was as if it was suffocating. I sprang to my feet. I stepped closer to the television screen. At that moment, my reflection pulled its hands away from its neck and opened its eyes. That expressionless yet threatening stare again, and that faint smile at the corner of its lips, as if to say, "You're only noticing now." Something inside my head was beginning to break. My walls of logic were collapsing one by one. This wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination either. Everything I was seeing was too clear, too real. But this reality was not the one I knew. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen, made coffee. Every 10 minutes, I checked the clock, waiting for time to pass. But time seemed to have slowed since I brought that mirror into the house. Every second stretched like an eternity. The moment I closed my eyes, I heard that clicking sound, as if someone were walking barefoot around the house. But the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was as if nails were tapping against the inner lining of my skull, right at the back of my mind. "Open," a voice said, like a whisper, yet at the same time like a scream drilling into my brain. "It's very cold inside." Bow quotes. After that whisper in the kitchen, silence was no longer comforting yet. Had become a threat. That voice, saying it's very cold inside, wasn't just a vibration my ears picked up. It felt like the trace left by an icy hand crawling up my spine. When I finally got into bed that night, I stared at the ceiling for hours. In the darkness, everything felt more alive. The sound of the floorboards expanding, the wind hitting the shutters, and that metallic scraping coming from the mirror in the corridor. I slowly sat up in bed. When my feet touched the icy floorboards, I shuddered. I stepped into the corridor. The silver-framed mirror shimmered like a pool of silver under the moonlight. I moved closer. My reflection stood right there, but this time there was a difference. I was gasping for breath, my chest rising and falling rapidly. My reflection, however, was completely motionless. Its shoulders were fixed, its gaze frozen. It wasn't breathing. I slowly raised my right hand and touched the cold surface of the mirror. The moment my fingertips felt the smoothness of the glass, I was jolted. My reflection had not raised its hand. It was still standing there, arms at its sides, staring directly into my eyes. The glass barrier between us seemed too thin to turn into liquid. "What are you?" I whispered. My voice didn't echo in the empty corridor. It was as if the mirror had swallowed the sound. My reflection's lips slowly curled upward. This wasn't my smile. My teeth weren't that sharp. My lips, not that thin. From the very center of the mirror, a thin, hairline crack stretched from top to bottom. Crack. The sound exploded through the silence, like thunder. From within the crack, a black, tar-dark liquid began to seep out slowly. But it didn't flow downward. It seemed to defy gravity, crawling upward towards the corners of the ceiling. When I woke up the next morning, I found myself curled up in the middle of the corridor, right in front of the mirror. My whole body was stiff, my bones aching. I was afraid to look at the mirror, yet I couldn't take my eyes off it. The crack was still there. The black seepage had completely covered the silver frame, forming strange, hieroglyph-like shapes on the wall. When I went into the bathroom to get ready for work, I swore not to look at the mirror. I bent over the sink and splashed my face with ice-cold water. When I lifted my head, I saw writing on the fogged glass. This wasn't something wiped on from the outside. It had been traced from behind the glass, from the inside, with a finger. It's my turn. I staggered back in horror. That was when I realized the house's architecture was changing. The corridor seemed longer, the door to my bedroom farther away than it should have been, and the smell. That damp, routing stench was no longer just in the kitchen, it was everywhere, as if the walls of the house were pulsing like the internal organs of a living creature. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call someone, to find a fragment of logic in this madness. But the names in my contacts had been erased. The screen reflected like a mirror, and what I saw in that reflection was not me. The reflection on the screen was slowly peeling the skin from its face with its fingernails. I felt the pain on my own face. When I touched my cheek, my fingers came away smeared with a warm, sticky substance. It wasn't blood, it was the black tar seeping from the mirror. As the sun set, the house plunged into darkness. The power hadn't gone out, but the bulbs burned so weakly that they only made the shadows sharper. I stood in the living room, facing that silver-framed mirror. I knew there was no point in running anymore. This wasn't a hallucination, it was an invasion. I don't know how long I stood there. Hours, minutes. Time had lost all meaning in front of that frame. My reflection was still looking at me, but the expression in its eyes had changed. There was no threat, no anger, just familiarity, as if it was the one that belonged there. I raised my hand. This time, it raised its hand at the same moment. No delay at all. I felt a strange sense of relief. The tension inside me was easing. Maybe I had been the problem all along. Maybe that thing in the mirror was just me. I turned my back and looked around the living room. The sofa, the table, the window, everything was in its place. The house was quiet, normal. When I turned back to the mirror, my reflection was smiling at me, just like me. That's when I realized it. The unease that had been growing inside me for days whenever I looked at the mirror was gone, because I was no longer alone. I stepped away from the mirror. I headed for the door, but in the glass of the door, in the bathroom mirror, on the black screen of the television, the same reflection was there in all of them, and none of Tim were in sync with me. If one day, when you look into a mirror, you feel your reflection lag behind you for a moment, do not look away, because that delay is not a mistake. It is a rehearsal for taking your place.